This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, I'll be discussing the life of Malcolm X as well as his ideas in the 21st century. I will be speaking with Vibert White, an expert on such, and the conversation will begin in a moment. Today's topic is Malcolm X and his views as they relate to the 21st century. Dr. Vibert White is my guest. He is a professor at the University of Central Florida. He has also written a book called Inside the Nation of Islam some years ago, and I will be speaking with him a bit about Malcolm X, but more so the ideas of the man than the man himself, since there's plenty of things online about Malcolm X's life. But first, let me just ask Vibert if you could take a minute or two, give a little bit of background about yourself, your interest in Malcolm X, the Nation of Islam, and so forth.
Yes, thank you, Dan, for the invite to your show. As you mentioned, I am an expert on the Nation of Islam and the life and the teachings of Malcolm X. I've been involved with the Nation and Malcolm X ideas and study for most of my adult life, over 30 years, to be honest with you. Within the Nation of Islam, I'm one of the few scholars who have been within the organization to write about the organization and to help chart what I call a new future of the organization. I'm one of the few scholars in the country who has actually ever seen the personal papers between Malcolm X, Honorable Elijah Muhammad, Louis Farrakhan, Fidel Castro, and a host of others. In fact about it, Dan, right now, we're trying to find a home, a university home for the Nation of Islam papers that will house many of the materials that we're going to talk about today. So when we talk about Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam and his legacy, it's one that we have to revisit and look at and to really try to understand where does Malcolm X stand today within the course of study and the course of liberation and the course of our country.
Well, Malcolm X's life was famously chronicled in Alex Haley's book, The Autobiography of Malcolm X, and it's one of the seminal books in my youth. Even though I grew up as a white kid in New York, I grew up poor and I grew up in an urban environment. So a lot of the things that he said about the environments he grew up with in Detroit resonated with me. But as I mentioned, since so much is available about Malcolm X's actual life, including these books, many books written about him, I wanted to focus more on sort of the legacy of Malcolm X with you. And since you talked about having seen all the papers, famously Malcolm X towards the end of his life had a split with the Nation of Islam, and he had done the journey to Mecca, and he seemed to be moving in a more traditional Muslim direction than the black Muslims or the Nation of Islam was. Would you agree with that assessment? And if he had lived, say, another 30 or 40 years, where do you think his philosophical output would have reached? Would he have been more a traditional Muslim? Would he have gone back to the Nation of Islam, or somewhere in between?
Somewhere in between. First of all, Malcolm X never did leave his concept or his ideas of black nationalism. That's within the Nation of Islam and outside the Nation of Islam. He believed in black self-determinism, black self-help, black business enterprise and development. That was a mainstay within his philosophy. He believed in self-defense and black self-capitalism. So that remained constant. In reference to his move from, i.e., the Nation of Islam to mainstream or conservative Islam because he finally saw the light, that is much overblown for the most part. For example, when we talk about him going to Mecca, well, in the late 1950s, he was in Medina. And if anyone who's a Muslim scholar or a Muslim period know that Medina is the second city of Islam and within the lineage of the religion. So what he saw in Medina, he would see in Mecca. That is people praying together, different types of people, white, black, Asian, and whatnot, would be together. That part of the story is oftentimes overlooked. The argument, rather, is that Malcolm made this journey and this image as changing was more because of political ideology and political reasons, to be honest with you. And that is, he needed a platform. He had left the Nation of Islam. His resources, financial resources, were gone. His podium, in many respects, was gone. So therefore, he had to recreate himself. And one of the best ways to recreate himself at that time is to give an idea that all what he believed in the past was wrong, and to create another story that would allow other people to help him, to finance him, and to give him a new start for what he needed and where he wanted to go. So that must be understood, in which many people ignore. Because again, many people, except for myself and a few people, not even Manny Marable, who wrote a tremendous book on Malcolm X a few years ago. He is at, I think, NYU or Columbia. He didn't even see the full papers as I have. I am the only scholar in the United States and the world who's really seen the full papers and the writings of Malcolm that deals with the issue that I'm speaking of.
When you
So
go ahead.
Yeah. So that part is much overblown. Now, would he have been a mainstream Islam now? I don't even know what that means, really, because there are various schools in Islam. It's just not Shiites and Sunnis, but there are Shiites, Sunnis, Ahmadiyas, Lions, 5%ers. There are several different schools of Islam, and several of these schools have beliefs that there is a messenger after Prophet Muhammad. And no one ever says that these schools are out of line with traditional Islam. In fact, about it, when people like Malcolm went to Mecca, and even Elijah Muhammad, who made Hajj to Mecca in the late 1950s, no one ever asked them once they go there, what type of Muslims they are. To be a Muslim, all you have to say is that there's no God but Allah, Muhammad is his messenger. So this whole element about mainstream and separation, that is an argument that white America really developed to keep a split within Malcolm from other people who may want to be with the Nation of Islam or be with him, to keep that split going. And that is a wrong one. That needs to be really analyzed and reviewed. And again, most scholars, for whatever reason, find it necessary to ignore that really important aspect of the story of Malcolm, the Nation of Islam, and his legacy.
Well, Malcolm X died a few weeks after I was born in early 1965. And other than his religious views, you had mentioned about his political activism. And famously, in America, especially in the 60s and even to this day, there was always the playing off of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X as sort of the good civil rights activists and the bad civil rights activists. Either, Martin Luther King as the guy who promoted peace and understanding, whereas Malcolm was the guy with the angry black man. Do you think that had Malcolm X lived, that he would have come more closely to some of the ideas that King had, or do you think he would have gravitated more towards groups like the Black Panthers of the late 60s and early 70s?
I think it would have been a both. First of all, if you look at Martin Luther King's, one of his last great speeches before his untimely assassination in 1968, you see that Martin Luther King gave a lecture right in your home city of New York, uptown in Harlem, titled "Why I Oppose the Vietnam War." And he issued and said some of the same things that Malcolm X said. He said, "One, I cannot endorse a war against innocent people any longer. I cannot endorse colonialism. I cannot any longer tell Black Americans, young Black Americans, not to fight for their rights when the United States is using violence against people of color and people who are innocent." So therefore, we will see that Martin Luther King was gravitating towards Malcolm X on concepts of Black nationalism, economic development, and this whole element of self-determinism. Not Malcolm towards Martin Luther King. You see, so we see that taking place. If he had lived, would he have supported the Black Panthers? I am not so sure. I think that he would have supported them on principles of self-determinism, But on issues, remember that Black Panthers were a leftist organization. Their economic route was communism or socialism. And Malcolm never was down with that. Even with all his alliances and with his travels throughout the world, he traveled to places like Ghana. At the time, that wasn't communist. That was a democracy, and that was following ultimately an ideology called Nkrumahism by Kwame Nkrumah. He went to Nasser, Egypt. He met with President Nasser. Nasser was not a communist by no means, even though he had aligned himself with the Soviet Union. And when even Malcolm met with Fidel Castro and at the Teresa Hotel in Harlem, well, in 1960, he never endorsed the concept of communism. He endorsed the concept of self-help and fighting against oppressors who were oppressing people. So the point, going back to the Black Panthers, would he have aligned with them on principles of self-determinism and self-defense, health programs which the Black Panthers developed, programs of economic development, programs of educational activities in the Black community. On those things he would have aligned with, but on other things based on socialism or communism, he would not have.
Well, Malcolm X, as the years went on, as you had mentioned, seemed to be getting more universal in his concerns, not just about blacks and racism in America, but as you mentioned, oppression in various other places around the world. Certainly in the last 50 years and since the end of the Cold War, I mean, a lot of the Arab world, a lot of the Islamic world were basically seen as pawns during the Cold War. But then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we've seen the rise of democratic movements in a lot of mostly Muslim countries in the Middle East. What do you think that Malcolm X would have thought had he lived another 30 or 40 years about, say, the Arab-Israeli conflict, about the Arab Spring, the overthrowing of people like Gaddafi, the overthrowing of Saddam Hussein, the Iranian Revolution? Do you think he would have taken them on case-by-case bases?
I think he would have highlighted one, not the hypocrisy, but some of the issues of oppression that maybe President Hussein or President Gaddafi may have utilized against their own people. But at the same time, he would have highlighted the importance of Gaddafi, especially in his Pan-Africanist approach of trying to unify Africa, as well as trying to develop a Pan-Arab concept to unify that people. Remember, foremost, Malcolm X was against colonialism, and he would have recognized that the Middle East are pretty much geographical zones that are controlled by neo-colonialist forces. And he would have recognized this again with North Africa and throughout the Black African basin. So therefore, in my estimation, he would have said, one, the Arab Spring was nothing more than a mechanism that was developed by Western powers to undermine the African states and the Arab states. I think he would have been foremost in saying that. I think that he would have recognized that even though Gaddafi has some various issues and some problems, that one, Gaddafi was the wealthiest man in the world when he was assassinated, and that he was utilizing his money to make Africa a stronger country, a stronger continent, and he was extending his reach to the Caribbean as well as other countries throughout the world that was being exploited by other people. So I think that he would have been in the same camp with Mr. Gaddafi. I think he would have been in the camp with Mubarak on some issues, but scolding Mubarak on things that he did wrong to the Egyptian people. I think that he would have warned President Hussein about getting too close to the United States. I think he would have been very, very careful and trying to create an ideology and philosophy for the Libyans to be cautious of Western domination and to maybe temper their relationship with North Korea.
Yeah. A few months ago, I watched the famous film by Gillo Pontecorvo, The Battle of Algiers, and in that film, it's basically about getting rid of France from Algeria in the 1950s and 60s, and you can see, in a lot of sense, two evils on display: the evils of colonialism, but then also the evils of religious extremism too. And I just wonder, when you look at groups like Boko Haram or ISIS or Al Qaeda. Certainly, I mean, when you talk about the Pan-Africanism of Gaddafi, I'm certain that Malcolm X would have supported that. But as you say, I mean, Gaddafi was a brutal dictator who, ruled his country with an iron fist and whatnot. So, do you think there's a way to extricate uh, a good, some good that a movement can do versus the evil it does? For example, a lot of these extremist Islamic groups today, their treatment of women is abominable.
Well, I think that when you look at leadership of any society or country, you weigh the leaders by their good and their bad. None of them are perfect. When we look at Thomas Jefferson, for example, we see that he's a brilliant man. He created something wonderful for our founding society, but he's a slaveholder too. You weigh the good and the bad at the same time, and you take what is good that was needed from that man to create a society, and you try to negate or discard what they did that was wrong, even though they will be judged by that wrong. Now, in reference to Malcolm X, remember that when he started the Organization of African American Unity, along with the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, he stopped preaching Islam. People forget that. After he left the Nation of Islam, for the most part, he stopped preaching Islam. He said that, listen, your religion is a personal thing. All right? Your religion is between you and your God. We're not going to get into an argument about religion. He said the bigger issue right now is human rights. And so that's what he focused on, not religion. All right? So he would have been against any element of extremism. Mm-hmm. If it's Muslims, if it's Catholic, if it's Jews or anyone, he would be against any element of extremism because, again, he had moved away from that whole element of Islam. I mean, you can't find one lecture after he left the Nation of Islam that he's preaching Islam. Not one.
You actually anticipated one of my questions, and that is, do you think that Malcolm X, had he lived to be a 70, 80-plus-year-old man, that he would have actually become more secular, that he was actually moving away from religion in general, not just Islam specifically, but moving towards a more secular, humanist ideal?
By all means, he was a humanist. By all means, by that. Islam was a vehicle where he could exert his philosophy. But yes, would he have remained a Muslim? Of course, that's his roots, that's his belief system. But he would have said that, listen, we have to live in a state where everyone can function equally. We cannot live in a state where one religion is dominant over another, where religion is the impetus to control people. I think he would have been that type of person, more secular in that perspective. All eyes and all analysis points to that. If you really understand Malcolm and see Malcolm and read his materials, so I think he wanted a society that practiced morality. And if that morality is based on Christianity or Judaism or Islam or Hinduism or Voodoo or Santeria, then so be it.
Well, let me ask you, since you
That's
said,
what he brought.
yes, since you've said that you've seen papers that other people have not, I've read, and I don't know if it's true, so you can inform me if I'm wrong. I've read that Malcolm X, when he did go to Mecca, that he did encounter, for example, some Sufis, and that he was greatly taken with a lot of the Sufi mysticism and the joyous singing and dancing, and Sufism is often outlawed in a lot of the more hardline Islamic countries. But for those who don't know, Sufism is a very more arts and dancing and music based. It's the singing the praise of God and nature, which is something that's frowned upon in a lot of more mainstream Islam society. Is it true that Malcolm X did encounter Sufism, and what was his beliefs about the Sufist branch of Islam?
He encountered that not just in Saudi Arabia, but in Ghana, Africa, Ghana, West Africa, and in other parts of West Africa where you have a large Muslim base.
Yeah.
And people have to understand that the majority of the Muslim world believe in some element of mysticism. You may call it Sufism, but believe in some element of mysticism that aligns with natural religions or the ethnic religions of those people, the majority of them. The minority of Islam are the Sufis, not the Sufis, but the Shiites and the Sunnis. The Sunnis, they are the minority of Islam, and the other ones are in the majority. So therefore, when he saw what you call Sufism and mysticism in Africa, and he worshipped with the brothers in Africa who was praising Allah, but also aligned with it. Because remember, his father was a minister. And if you go to any African American church, it's a mixture of Christianity and African belief system. So therefore, it was not a jump. It was not a hard thing for him to see or understand. In fact, it resonated with him. And also remember, the elements of Islam within the nation of Islam, you can call Sufism. I mean, anytime you have the mysticism of a Farj Muhammad, the mysticism of Elijah Muhammad, having a different relationship with a God, all right, and utilizing different herbs and things, that is part of mysticism, that is part of Sufism, and that is part of the African and African American experience. If it's Judaism, if it's Black Hebrews, you see mysticism in there that is not practiced in what you may call traditional Judaism. If you see, if it's Christianity, all you have to do is go to any Black church. If it's in New Orleans, New York, or South Carolina, you see people speaking of spirits, getting happy, having a relationship that you will not see in the traditional white church. If it's in Islam, when I went to West Africa, same place that Malcolm X went to, I was blown away too, because I said, "Wow, this Islam here is really funky." They were singing, they were laughing, they were dancing. I had never seen that before, and that resonated with me. And then the Muslim Sufis in West Africa are just like the Voodooists that's in Haiti. The leaders can talk about the future, can read the future. They have special herbs that heal you. They give you special Quranic verses that they will write for you to keep on your body. That's part of the African experience. So therefore, Africa, which Malcolm recognized, Africanized Islam, Africanized Christianity, Africanized Judaism, and he was down with it. He didn't see no contradictions.
Well, let's turn back to the U.S. and the present day, because as I said, it's now over 50 years since Malcolm X was killed, and we just had 8 years of the first Black president in American history, Barack Obama. Where do you think Malcolm X, if he could have lived, or if he had a crystal ball and could see the state of America today, do you think he would be mostly pleased, or do you, I mean, obviously there's a lot of work to go, and we'll talk about some things in a moment, but do you think he'd be mostly pleased with the direction that America has taken?
I think Malcolm X would have been very disappointed with President Obama. Malcolm X was not the type of man, and his philosophy did not demonstrate that he wanted a black place. He wanted a black face in a high place just because they were black. He wanted a black person in a position of influence and power who would generate real substantial change in American as well as in Black American policy and throughout the African world. On those lines, I think with certainty that Mr. Malcolm X, Brother Malcolm X, would have been greatly disappointed with Obama, with his lethargic movement to aid urban Black America, with his reluctance to meet with certain African American leaders, with his tokenism towards Africa and giving aid, with his constant reprimanding to Black Americans that they're not doing what is proper, with his increasing in wars in North Africa and the Middle East that Obama did, with his deportation policy. We talk about Trump's deportation policy, but Obama's deportation policy, I think that Brother Malcolm X would have been upset with him and called Brother Obama on the carpet to discuss this. Remember, Malcolm was a truth teller, and he was one of the first people to really bring America on the carpet, to critique America, to analyze America in its rawness. He didn't try to make political gain. He did not try to make people feel good. In fact, Malcolm used to say that one of the problems with black leadership, like Obama, is that they're busy trying to tell the larger white community how good they are and how nice they are, instead of telling the truth and being forthright on the issues at hand. Because Malcolm said it's better to tell the truth and be respected for the truth than to tell a lie and have no respect for you. And that's where, and I think he would have been he would have taken Obama to task.
Yeah, I'm a social liberal, and I voted twice for Obama because I think in many ways he was a centrist. And I did think he did some good. I think he didn't do enough on things like banking regulations. Donald Trump now is trying to roll back the few good things Obama did there. I would have liked to have seen Obama stand up more for labor unions and close Guantanamo Bay. But do you think that Obama was hamstrung not only by the fact that he was the first black president, but because of his name and his background, that the idea that he was somehow an agent of Islam also hampered him, and that Obama responded too cowardly or too lackadaisically? Is that what you mean when you say that Malcolm X would have called him out on that?
Yes. And remember, Obama, he's my brother, and we appreciate his service to the country and his continued service to our nation and the world. But he was not of the pedigree of black activism. What I mean by that, in your own city, you had one of the greatest black political leaders of all time, and that was Adam Clayton Powell Jr. in your own city, congressman out of Harlem. And Adam Clayton Powell, he knew how to fight. He knew how to call a spade, and he did things outrageously sometimes to make a point. When you have Obama, he was not part of that pedigree. All right, he was not part of urban America and toughness. I mean, surely he lived in Chicago, but he's not a real Chicagoan. All right, he's not that type of pedigree who knew how to fight like a Malcolm or an Adam Clayton Powell Jr. or a Rangel. So therefore, he's more concerned about being politically nice, not hurting anyone's feeling, showing that he can be tough on Black America and that he's the president of everyone, and that he is not going to really show his ethnicity and leanings. And I think Malcolm X would have been very, very upset with him at all, completely. I think Malcolm X would have supported a person like a Shirley Chisholm out of your own city again in Brooklyn, who ran for office in '72. Yeah. Because she was unbossed or unbought. That was her idea, unbought and unbossed. I think he would have supported maybe Booker, who's the senator now out of New Jersey.
Cory Booker.
Cory Booker, who's a little bit straight. He's a sharpshooter. I think he would have supported a person like that. I even think he would have supported a Bernie Sanders, to be honest with you. All right? Because at this time, even though he was a nationalist, he didn't see people by color. And I give you a point by that. Do you know who's godfather of Malcolm's children?
No.
The godparent of Malcolm's children was Mike Wallace of 60 Minutes.
Oh, okay.
All right? You realize that Mike Wallace was the one who financed and helped to give Malcolm money when he was out of the Nation of Islam. And when he was assassinated, he single-handedly economically supported Betty and the children.
Well, that's interesting because famously Mike Wallace did I think it was on CBS, did the documentary about the Nation of Islam. I forget the name, back in '59, that drew a lot of criticism about the Nation of Islam.
That's right, and in fact, Malcolm enjoyed that because it highlighted for the first time the Nation of Islam and Malcolm's rise to stardom for the American community. Yeah. So he saw the good in that, and after that, Malcolm and Wallace had several conversations that we've seen letters of that most people have never seen. They admired each other. Yeah. I mean, Mike wasn't this staunch Jewish guy who hated black and hated the nation, by no means. And Malcolm wasn't this staunch guy who hated Jews. He was not anti-Semitic. Yeah. So you see these types of things that's taken place between Malcolm, not just Malcolm and Wallace, Mike Wallace, but Malcolm and a host of other white and Jewish and socialistic leaders throughout the country.
Well, let me talk about an issue that's come up in the last few years and how it relates to Malcolm X. In a month or so, I'm going to be interviewing a former Baltimore policeman named Michael Wood, who broke news about corruption in Baltimore, about racism and other types of corruption in Baltimore. And he's sort of like a modern-day Frank Serpico. And I want to talk about, especially in the last few years of the Obama administration, with the increase of coverage about the shooting of black men, especially by cops, the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, and then counter movements, people talking about cops. Now, I grew up in New York City. I was born in 1965. Even in the early 70s when I was a kid, poor kids, white, black, Hispanic, were always harassed by cops. And so I always grew up with the mentality that cops, even though I lived in a very mafia, Goodfellas type environment, that cops were just as bad as some of the crooks that I grew up with. But without a doubt, this has always gone on. And one of the things that did frustrate me about Obama, for example, was, when I forget the white fellow who was not a cop, but who tracked this black kid and shot him. I think it was in Florida, George, whatever his name.
Zimmerman.
Yeah, Zimmerman. The George Zimmerman thing is like, okay, I want my president, whether he was black or white, to just come out and say that kind of racist shit should not happen. And Obama, as you said, would always get sort of mealy-mouthed. And there are certainly going to be cases, if you were to look at all the cases where a black person was shot, I'm sure that there have been some times when someone was actually committing a crime and doing some wrong, and there was no other way out. But there was also the example of, I think, the black fellow who shot on the ground, who was a nurse's aide for a retarded white boy or something a year or so ago. Well, so with all of these cases, what do you think? Do you think that would have? I mean, obviously Malcolm X would not have been against it. How do you think politically he would have approached such a topic? Would he have been far more direct than an Obama or other black leaders? Because there has always seemed to me to be sort of this void that since the death of Malcolm X and then Martin Luther King, there hasn't been any real leader in the black community, political, religious, whatever, that has attained that kind of status. Do you think that Malcolm X has been mythologized too much, that current black leaders just can't fill that void, or why hasn't anyone stepped up to really hold, cops accountable?
Since Malcolm was a supreme organizer, and he knew through his rhetoric how to connect the political, the historical, and the current state of affairs. There was an example in Harlem, I think it was in 1962, of a brother by the name of Hinton X. He was beat. by some policemen in Harlem. Some brothers and sisters saw him, and they reported to Malcolm that they had taken this young Muslim man, into the precinct and did not call the hospital. Malcolm immediately organized over 400 brothers and sisters, and many of them were not Muslims, and they walked from 125th Street to where the precinct was, took over traffic, and Malcolm demanded that he sees this man. And when he goes to see him, he sees that this brother's in bad political shape, bad physical shape. And so he tells the police to call the ambulance now. Now the police kind of wanted to resist. And Malcolm said, before you make a stance to resist me on this issue, look outside your window. And there were over 400 people ready to move on his command. The point is that Malcolm, if he was alive, he would have organized African Americans in such a way that if there was a negative response towards us with reference to police brutality, there would be a possibility that we will organize a resistance against the power structure. And remember, America is afraid of black organizations and a man that can organize in this manner. They will allow something like Black Lives Matter, because Black Lives Matter is not really organized. All they really do is walk around and have a sign that says, hands up, don't shoot, no peace, no justice. And they do that for a few hours and nothing happens. They don't mind a person like Al Sharpton in your city, who is going to say several things, but he works within the political structure, so he's not going to go out of those bounds. And they don't mind even a person like a Jesse or a T.D. Jakes that's going to work within a religious conservatism that's not going to allow them to really organize blacks to be not rebellious, but to be responsive in an organized and resistance manner. I think if Malcolm would have lived, you would have seen more groups like this. And then by seeing more groups like this, you would see a reduction of police brutality and hostility towards the African American community. Because there's nothing right now in America that places the larger white community in check on issues of police brutality. There's nothing. You can go to court, and most times when you go to court, there's some deal made where the family gets about $2 or $3 or $4 million for your death, and they're happy with it, and things still remain the same. Mm-hmm. And Malcolm also stated this: not only do you have to organize, but we have to take the United States to the UN on human rights violations. Now, one black leader in the United States right now has had the testicles to say that the United States has been and is violating the human rights of its black minority. Not one. You see? So therefore, if there's no real threat towards the system to take the movement to this level, then why should the system change?
Yeah. Well, let me ask about the post-Malcolm X. Since I've talked about what Malcolm X might have done had he lived, let's talk about what happened, though, post his death. I mentioned the Black Panthers, and they came and went by the 1970s. Their power, their influence was pretty much gone. And Louis Farrakhan has never had, say, the verbal gifts or the presence that Malcolm X did in terms of, or like as you said, the organizational skills. And it seems that the Nation of Islam has never really recovered from its, I guess, if you want to call, height of political influence, or that it did maybe in the 1960s. So do you think that the Nation of Islam is still a viable political entity, or do you think that there needs to be within Black America some fusion of religious or political organizations into something new? You talked about Black Lives Matter being ineffectual. Where is the power vacuum that some charismatic leader or some well-run organization can step into?
Well, Well, there's a correction. That correction is that the Nation of Islam actually, after the death and assassination of Malcolm X, actually grew. All right, by 1968, 69, the Nation of Islam was the largest and most powerful and wealthiest black organization in the country. They had a membership that was well into the millions. They were worth millions of dollars, and they had a presence in over 90 American cities, a large presence at that. So you actually see them going farther. In fact, under Elijah Muhammad, people like Stokely Carmichael, H. Rap Brown, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., all of them went. Martin Luther King even went into the house of Elijah Muhammad to have meetings with them. That again, the American people don't really know because they don't look at the scholarship. So therefore, the nation actually grew and had political power. Now, in reference to the leadership now with Louis Farrakhan, can you imagine? Louis Farrakhan now is the only man in the country, maybe minus Obama, who can draw over 1.5 million people on the National Mall. And you're right, he is not as gifted as Malcolm X in reference to philosophy and synthesizing his approach and his analysis. Not even close to it. However, if Malcolm was alive and if Farrakhan can draw 1.5 million people to Washington and utilize his organization to still be a juggernaut in black thought, imagine what Malcolm would have done if he was here. He was brighter politically than Louis Farrakhan because, I mean, he was older, had more experience. He was willing to push the envelope politically and socially in a way that Louis Farrakhan would not even consider. And then, actually, he's a better organizer than Louis Farrakhan. I mean, within 2 years, Malcolm X had developed 10 different mosques. All right, from Boston, Massachusetts, all the way down to Miami, even to the city that I live in, Orlando, Florida. So, I mean, if he would have lived, I think you would have seen a movement that would have surpassed the strength of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. You would have seen a far more sophisticated black political consciousness, and I think that you would have seen more black people being elected into political office. And I would also say, thirdly, with Malcolm, you would have had a black viable third party. Mm-hmm. We would have isolated the Republicans and the Democrats because, remember, Malcolm, he didn't give a damn about either party. He said they were both one and the same, exploitive to the poor, the black, the underclass. That's what I believe.
Let me end with two questions, and then we'll wrap up the interview in a final segment. First off, I want to talk about, let me start with Malcolm X's death. And do you believe that it was the Nation of Islam alone that killed Malcolm X, or do you think it was in concert with the FBI or the CIA? Who do you think killed Malcolm X?
I think it was in concert. Remember, in 1964, I believe, former FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover issued a report called the Counterintelligence Program. You may be familiar with it. And it's called the COINTELPRO Files for short. Yeah. And in that report, they said that the country must prevent the rise of a Messiah. And a Messiah is not a religious entity. A Messiah is just someone who can galvanize and unify and create a movement within Black America that will work cohesively towards the ending of oppression. And he said there were 4 people who could be that Messiah. One could have been Martin Luther King. 2 could have been the young Stokely Carmichael. 3, Elijah Muhammad. And 4, Malcolm X. And that these 4 people were targeted for to be negated, to have their influence negated, suppressed, destroyed, and even to the point of having these men killed. So therefore, there was a movement to isolate and to silence Malcolm. He was under surveillance since 1947. Now, what happened in 1947? Well, he was in jail, right? He's coming out of jail, and he wrote the president of the time, I think it was Truman, saying that, listen, Muslims should have the rights in jail, that he is a conscientious fellow who's not going to fight for the United States on any conflict, and that we're denied our rights. With that letter, he was under surveillance. Then when he got out of that, and within a short while, he moved quickly with a brother by the name of Lemuel Muhammad, who was his first teacher, not Elijah Muhammad. Lemuel Muhammad, all right, which was a teacher, a minister under Elijah Muhammad, taught Malcolm. And Lemuel Muhammad made Malcolm X his assistant minister in Detroit. And from that point on, Malcolm, at blazing speeds, took the Nation of Islam from a group of about 50,000 people within 5 years to a group of over 100,000 members. So the point is that it was a concerted effort to kill Malcolm. The black Muslims may have pulled the trigger, but the ones who really got them the gun and gave them the plans and created the skirmish within the movement was on the outside. Well, in fact, one last thing. And in fact, about it, before his death, I have a letter, all right, that shows that Malcolm X is writing the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, asking him for re-entry into the Nation of Islam, and saying that he is going to stop saying that they were out to kill him, because remember, Malcolm says that when he was in Europe, they did not allow him to deboard the plane in France, because they found out that the United States had issued an order to have him killed on soil, and the Frenchmen said, we don't want him killed on our soil, so they did not even let him off the plane.
Well, let me ask a final question about the use of violence, because I know towards the end of the life, Malcolm X, was sort of renouncing the use of overt violence. Do you think, had he lived, do you think he would have embraced more economic pressures, that he would have advocated boycotts of companies or countries? Do you think that he would, what strategies do you think he would have come up with to use if he was eschewing violence, overt physical violence? Because certainly I doubt Malcolm X would support any of these terrorist activities in the Middle East. He would not support, I don't think, any even terrorist acts here in this country. So what strategies do you think that he would have deployed, as I say, boycotting, economic sanctions, that kind of thing? Would he have been behind those?
Mr. Dan, you're absolutely right. He would have supported economic boycotts. That's the great equalizer of the movement against oppression. Remember when 4 black men were shot, and a few of them, 1 or 2 were killed in Los Angeles. They were from the mosque in Los Angeles. And I think in 1962 or 61, many of the Muslims said they wanted retaliation. Malcolm said, no, it cannot be retaliation. That's not our way. But he did issue an element of utilizing the tool of economic suppression, economic justice. That's Malcolm's words. So I know that he would have endorsed economic boycotting. And again, that's something that people are afraid of. And I'll give you a case in point. During the George Zimmerman case, I had a meeting with Al Sharpton of your town. And he came down to speak in Sanford. And I said to Mr. Reverend Sharpton. I said, Mr. Sharpton, what we need to have is an economic boycott. The first thing, because to show you how he is so in line with the power structure and so far away from the ideas of Malcolm X, the first thing he said, oh, we can't have a boycott because black people will starve in Florida. No, black people are not starving in Florida or any place else in this country at that level. He created an environment that says, let us talk a lot, let us voice hostility, but in turn do nothing. And that's the type of leadership that the power structure wants. A voice, a march, but a person and a group that does nothing. Mm-hmm. And Malcolm was not about that. Malcolm was about organizing and using the strength of the black community. And the only strength that we have at that time and now is economics.
Okay. Well, let's end this segment here. In the final segment, we'll just talk about what you'll be writing about in the future. And we'll do that in a moment. I've been speaking with Dr. Vibert White about the life and legacy of Malcolm X. Let me just turn more personally. I mentioned that you had written a book called Inside the Nation of Islam about 15 years ago. What is your current area of studies related to the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X?
Well, right now I am finishing up a piece on the legacy of Louis Farrakhan. As to what does he mean to Black America in the 21st century, and what did he bring to American society. The importance of this piece is because it's based on the fact that he is the closest political line and religious line to Malcolm X. Malcolm X taught him. He utilizes many of Malcolm's styles of rhetoric. In fact, some of the people who supported him, who still support him, were people that Malcolm recruited directly to the Nation of Islam. So I think that right now the jury is still out on Louis Farrakhan as to what he means. All we know is that he's the boogeyman to many Americans, but he's still vibrant in Black America. So I think a real study needs to be done, and that's what I'm doing. I worked with the man for many years. I know him better than most. And again, I've seen the personal papers that even Malcolm wrote of Lewis at the time. So if it's the will of God, that piece would be out next year sometime. And that's what I'm working on. And I'm also affiliated with a school called Polk State College, which is a small school that's in Central Florida.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to thank Dr. Vibert White for speaking about Malcolm X. I will have a link to his book as well. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, and thank you for the invite. I enjoyed the show. And, Dan, keep on doing what you're doing, because as Charles Houston would say, the great Charles Houston, a great legal mind, would say that you're a social engineer and you're utilizing your skills to give people empowerment. He said that a social engineer was either a person who helps society or a person who was a parasite on society. And for sure, you're not a parasite. You're doing a good job, and continue the good work that you're doing. May God bless you. Yes.